Adolf Hitler had a huge obsession with engineering projects that were, for the most part, bonkers. A mighty railway that would connect distant corners of the known world in an empire envisioned as the Great Third Reich, and change the way we travel. Pounding the steel rails from Lisbon to Moscow would be trains of staggering proportions, 6 meters wide with luxury apartments, cinemas, swimming pools, dog kennels, and of course 20mm anti-aircraft cannons, whisking passengers and troops away to far-off lands. Hitler's mega railway might have been called too ambitious by his own engineers, but was surprisingly closer to operation than you might think, even during World War II. So let's all jump aboard and ride the incredible and insane Reizbahn. Nothing was too big in school rethink of European borders. It requires a radical rethink of train design. There were no less than 41 different designs for the 23rd of June 1942. The director of Krupp, Edward Grote, suggested that they could build a 1,000-ton tank. It would be dubbed a new category of tank called a Land Cruiser or Landkreuzer, that would weld surplus battleship guns, have 25cm thick armor, and be its own anti-aircraft gun platform. For comparison, one of the best armored German tanks of the war, the Jagdtiger, only had frontal casemate armor of 250mm, and it's said to be never pierced frontally during its combat deployment in all of World War II. And thus the most insane tank project of the war, and perhaps even since then, was born. The P-1000 would have been huge. With a weight of 1,000 tons, it was 5 times bigger than even the heaviest Nazi tank of the war, the Panzer VIII. The tank would have been able to hold several motorcycles for scout missions, an infirmary, and had its own internal toilet system. To carry all this weight around over the ground, and not just sink into a crater, the mass would have been spread over 6 1.2-meter treads, although even with all its effort, the weight of the tank would have obliterated any sort of ground from roads to farms to buildings. Its actual size was staggering as well, at 39 meters long gun to tail, 14 meters wide, and 11 meters high, as big as a 4-story building. This height and 2-meter ground clearance would mean that it would be able to cross most rivers without any issues. A good thing too, as bridges were out of the question. To power the tank, it would have 2 diesel engines used in U-boats, with 8,400 horsepower each, with a total of 16,000 horsepower required to move the gigantic steel monster. Snorkels located across the frame would supply the engines with oxygen in the case of a river crossing. All of this was designed to carry its battleship-grade cannons. The primary weapon of this super tank would have been 2 280mm naval guns, the ones left over after the planned refitting of the Scharnhorst-class battleships. They didn't want to use a 3-gun turret because with the middle gun removed, there would be more room for ammunition, sighting, and reducing the weight of the tank by 50 tons. The cannons would have fired the same shells used by the battleships, or would have used special armor-piercing rounds and high explosive rounds for dissolving enemy armor or plowing up ground fortifications respectively. But wait, there's more. The tank had several other cannons on board, such as a single 128mm anti-tank cannon, most likely the Pak-44, or rather its subvariant, the KW-44, used later in the Jagdtiger and Maus, and planned for the E-100 tank. Apart from that, there were 2 turrets on the back equipped with the same gun, and 4 turrets with either double 20 or 37mm anti-air autocannons or quad 20mm guns, along with several machine guns. It's not clear how many crew this tank would have required, but judging by the smaller 200-ton Panzer VIII Mass requiring 6, we can imagine that this larger brother would be 20 to 41 men, with a commander, multiple gunners and loaders, drivers, radio operators, engineers, and scouts, as well as a doctor for the infirmary. With all these guns, armor, and internal toilets, the tank itself would only have been able to move at a top speed of 40 km per hour and have a range with its fuel tanks of 190 km. Even this, however, was highly unlikely and doubted from the start. Likely it also would have required a support convoy, escorts, and supply lines, much like we see today in an aircraft carrier group. To answer the question where it would have been deployed is quite obvious: the Eastern Front or Belgium, Netherlands, and Northern France, because of the simple fact that it could traverse mostly, if not strictly, across the flat terrain due to its weight and dimensions. The other important question is how it would have been deployed, and we can only speculate, but most likely Germans would use it as a mobile heavy artillery platform, using it to destroy enemy bunkers, fortresses, and heavily defended positions. The use of it against enemy armor is highly unlikely because of the very slow speed and agility, but it could have been used as a medium to long-range support for the armored units on the battlefield, with extremely accurate fire that could be coordinated during the assault. However, having in mind that most German operations were defensive from 1943, the purpose of this super tank was questionable. Would this tank be the wonder weapon that would save Nazi Germany? By December 29th of 1942, a few preliminary designs of the tank had been drafted. It had finally gotten a name, the Rat, likely because of the smaller brother was a mouse. It was preparing to enter prototype stage when some flaws were discovered. The fact that it couldn't use any roads, tunnels, or cross any bridges greatly hampered its actual operational feasibility. It would have not been able to invade cities, nor really protect any industrial targets. Moving around, it would have done more damage than the enemy. With its speed only being 40 km per hour, enemy armor could easily go around it, either encircling it to attack from weak spots, or straight up bypass it completely. Its huge size and slow speed would have also made it very vulnerable to airstrikes, even with its 8 AA guns. The Allies would have seen it coming, impossible to hide after all, and a few bombers would make short work of it. Lastly, thanks to its huge size, it would be completely reliant on its own engines and drivetrains. If the tank broke down, it would become a giant paperweight. There was no other way to drag it or tow or even put it on rail. Speaking of, the tank couldn't be transported via trains because of its size and weight. Perhaps the Breitsperbahn, that was also envisioned by Nazi Germany, would be able to carry this steel monster. Another issue is that the Allies and Soviets would probably make it their top priority to get rid of these beasts. Just like the Bismarck, Tirpitz, and Yamato were hunted to kill at any cost, the same fate would await the Ratte on the battlefield, making it more of a nuisance to defend rather than the effective assault weapon. But you know for absolute fact that the story doesn't end here, because instead of just cancelling the project, they thought, why not just make the tank bigger? 500 tons bigger. I know you think by this point that these Nazi projects couldn't get any more ridiculous, but the Landkreuz P-1500 monster was certainly up there. The P-1500 was going to be a self-propelled gun platform carrying a 800mm cannon with a range of 37 kilometers. It would have had 250mm hill front armor requiring 4 diesel engines and have over 100 crew members. It would essentially be the same as the famous Schwerer Gustav railway gun, but without the railway. It would be incredibly slow, however, cruising around Europe at walking speed of 7 kilometers per hour. Whilst this project is popular, there isn't any real solid design work found, leading many to consider this either the work of a lone engineer or perhaps even a straight propaganda hoax. Needless to say, both this Cannon tank and the P-1000 both suffered the flaw of being too big, too slow, and too vulnerable to Allied aircraft, an air advantage that the Allies had secured by 1943. As such, the Minister of Armament, Albert Speer, cancelled both projects and the world never got its super tank. If you want to see more Nazi content, then I suggest you check out our other video about the insane Nazi railway, or perhaps the supposed Nazi experiments with UFO technology. This video today was originally pitched to us by our Patreon, Big Dan. If you would like to become a Patreon just like Big Dan and go on to suggest topics for Found and Explained, then I'll leave a link down in the description where you can become a Patreon, see videos early, discuss with us, and as I said, suggest ideas. And we also have channel members with the exact same benefits. So thanks again so much for watching, and see you all in the next video. Stukas were taking off from the deck one by one somewhere in the Atlantic. Their goal was simple: obliterate the US fleet and open the door for the invasion of New York. Of course, this never happened, but have you ever asked yourself at some point, where were the German aircraft carriers in World War II? Did Hitler even have any? Well, they did. Sort of. Nazi Germany built an aircraft carrier in World War II and had 3 more planned to be the cutting-edge weapon of its Atlantic fleet. It was one of the largest ships built during the war, but it was never deployed. This is the Kriegsmarine's lost dream and the story behind the Graf Zeppelin aircraft carrier. Now, you've all heard the word Zeppelin, and the first thing that pops into your mind are large airships, most notably the famous Hindenburg. But this Zeppelin was a bit different. Named after Count, or in German, Graf Ferdinand von Zeppelin, the inventor of the airships bears the name in his honor, the first German aircraft carrier of World War II. Hitler hoped that it would be one of the critical factors in beating the Royal Navy and dominating the seas. You see, the German Navy was never as strong as the British one, and it was clear to Hitler in 1934 that if he wished to compete with the British in a potential conflict in the future, then the Kriegsmarine should be strengthened and new types of ships would need to be developed. Plan Z was the name of the German plan to strengthen the Kriegsmarine's presence in the Atlantic Ocean and even the odds against the Royal Navy. Among other things, it listed aircraft carriers as one of the priorities, and 4 Graf Zeppelin carriers were planned to be built in total. And having the new German Air Force limited by land air bases wouldn't do it all, hence an aircraft carrier would be the perfect cornerstone of the new German Navy and its Air Force. But rather than following the design of classic aircraft carriers, the idea was to incorporate heavy guns into the design, so the ship could defend itself against potential enemies. The main weaponry of the ship, apart from the aircraft obviously, would have been 16 150mm guns, the same ones used as secondary armaments on the Bismarck and Scharnhorst battleships. A further 12 heavy anti-air 105mm guns would accompany a number of smaller 37 and 20mm AA guns. This was much heavier firepower compared to some of the comparable aircraft carriers of World War II, for example the Essex class or the Japanese Akagi. Even compared to the USS Lexington, which were one of the largest ships of the war. And now that we mentioned Akagi, it's interesting to note that the Germans actually obtained drawings and technical data from it and used it in the development of their own carrier. And this carrier was to be truly massive. At 262 meters in length, its beam would be 31.5 meters. And if you're wondering what that is, well, basically it's the fancy naval name for the widest point on the ship. And its draft was 7.6 meters, where draft is the distance from the waterline to the bottom of the keel, or in simple English, the hull of the ship. Displacement of the ship was 33.5 thousand tons, and it had a maximum speed of projected 35 knots. Ironically, this huge aircraft carrier to take on the British could only exist because of the British. In an attempt to appease and improve relations between Germany and Britain, they had agreed to increase the displacement limit up to 38.5 thousand tons for aircraft carriers, greater than the limit of the Treaty of Versailles. This massive ship would also require a crew of 2,000, with 300 of them being aircrew and the rest sailors and officers. In terms of aircraft on board, we'll get to that in a minute, so just hang on. With the green light confirmed, the keel was laid in 1936, and we move forward 3 years towards the start of the war in 1939. The first ship in the series would bear the exact same name as its class and would be launched in 1938, with the second aircraft carrier undergoing construction, simply called Carrier B. As the war started, the Zeppelin ship was moved from Kiel, Germany to Gortenhafen, now Gdynia, in Poland. But with the invasion of Norway in 1940, Nazi Germany suddenly found itself with a ton of new beachside real estate to defend, namely all those beautiful Norwegian fjords. All the work on the Carrier A and B were stopped, and its 15cm guns were taken away to be mounted as coastal defense in Norway, and its 10.5cm flak cannons were also removed. It was then decided that the B carrier should be scrapped, and focus would then move to the construction of more U-boats, as those had been very effective during the war so far. And the current Zeppelin hull, well, that ended up becoming a store for timber. But this isn't the end of the story. We move forward 2 more years to 1942, just after a little-known attack called Pearl Harbor. Success of the aircraft carrier in combat was widely proven by this point in time, and German Admiral Erich Raeder proposed to Hitler that the work should continue on the ship, which the evil mustache guy, no, not that one, had already approved. In the original plans, Graf Zeppelin was to carry Bf-109Ts and U-87C aircraft, along with the Fieseler Fi-167 torpedo bomber. So that's up to a total of 42 aircraft on board. However, in 1942, Raeder wanted new aircraft specifically designed to be launched from an aircraft carrier, just like the many that the Japanese and Americans had deployed in the Pacific, namely the Messerschmitt 155 or the naval version of the Bf-109. This project would be later developed by, and let me absolutely butcher this name, Blum und Voss, into a high-altitude interceptor made to fight against the US bombers like the B-29. Future video on that, anyone? Let me know down in the comments. Back to the story. His idea was rejected because by 1942, the Germans were knees deep into Soviet mud. Literally. And the Luftwaffe couldn't take on new projects, so it was decided to go back to the first proposed idea. The idea was to have the ship ready to enter the fight by 1943, with the aircrew already undergoing through special training. But again, Hitler being Hitler, you can guess what happened next. Because of the loss of both the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst, the overall poor performance of surface ships compared to the U-boat, the Führer ordered all work to be stopped on any new designs. He then removed radar from command and ordered to focus only on U-boat development. The ship was moved near Stettin and left there to rot for another 2 years before it met its sad end. The Red Army was advancing fast, and in 1945, Germans, aware that the war was lost and wanting to deprive the enemy of their beloved ship, which was pretty sad by this point in time, placed explosives and sunk the ship down into the depths. Unfortunately, the depths weren't very deep, and in the shallow waters off the coast, it ended up just being half sunk. The Soviets couldn't actually use the carrier for themselves again, but they weren't done with it. It was refloated in 1946, towed somewhere deep into the Baltic Sea, and sunk in a training exercise in 1947. A truly sad ending to a ship just like this. But in 2006, a Polish research vessel found the remains of the Graf Zeppelin aircraft carrier some 80 meters below the surface, around 35 kilometers from the coast. It was examined and with fair certainty concluded that this really was the last Zeppelin lying in its grave. So your question is, had this aircraft actually been built and deployed, it's hard to say whether or not it would have actually turned the tide of war. Rather, it's likely that this ship would have been a big target and hunted down, much like the Bismarck. Nazi Germany ended up lacking the resources to really take the fight to the US mainland, and a Pearl Harbor, New York-style attack didn't seem to be on the cards. Although had the Horten brothers also finished their America bomber, perhaps this aircraft carrier could have fixed the flaw with launching it to the US mainland. Let me know down in the comments what you think would have been the outcome had this aircraft carrier actually been built and used by the German forces. I would love to know some alternative history. And thanks again so much for watching, and if you don't want to miss the opportunity to see new videos, please hit that like and subscribe button, and check out the Patreon if you want to support the channel and see behind the scenes. I'll see you in the next video on Found and Explained. Near the closing hours of World War II, the Nazis started to experiment with more unconventional aircraft designs, and technologies that some would consider unnatural. With the ability to fly in any direction at a moment's notice, invisible to radar, and the ability to launch guided missiles, this new flying saucer would have changed the tide of war. The question remains, did the Nazis ever actually build a UFO? And what happened to the project? Hold on to your disbelief for this extra spooky Halloween spectacular at Found and Explained. UFO. Those three letters provide more excitement and more controversy than any other letters in the English language. UFOs, or unidentified flying objects, are the stuff of legends and speculation the world over, not to mention the stuff of heated debates and alleged government cover-ups that have spanned decades now. But before you start to wonder if you're somehow on the wrong channel, or if I've suddenly changed my focus from aviation to conspiracies of the alien variety, just relax. This video will still be about aviation, just aviation with a slightly more paranormal twist. As you may have guessed, the topic will be about UFO planes, or rather, UFO-inspired aircraft. Perhaps it shouldn't be too surprising that it was the Nazi Germans that were believed to have first tinkered seriously with the idea of UFO craft. After all, the evil empire, or the Third Reich, had a propensity for daft, even maniacal ideas, which was evident in some of the completely bonkers technology that they tried to invent. So it's not a stretch to imagine the demented Nazis making efforts to produce an alien-like aircraft. And perhaps the technology wasn't so unreal after all. Let's dive into it, shall we? It's well documented that Nazi Germany had conducted research into advanced propulsion technology. That included rocket technology too, of course, with the infamous V2 rocket being the precursor to intercontinental ballistic missiles that we use and have today. This rocket wizardry within the Third Reich explains why Nazi German scientists were plucked up by both the United States and the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War II for their own rocket projects. But German obsession with cutting-edge technology went back farther in time, everything from flying wings and some things otherworldly, such as anti-gravity. Now I know my audience is rolling their eyes, especially when I covered anti-gravity last time, but bear with me for a hot minute. Anti-gravity research had started in the Weimar Germany in the 1920s. The RFZ-1 craft was the first anti-gravity aircraft that also happened to be circular in shape. The craft wasn't constructed by German military, but by the ultra-secretive and occultist Virile Society based in Berlin. Hermann Oberth's book, By Rocket to Interplanetary Space, published in 1923, did much to spur on German experimentation in aircraft and spacecraft development. It resulted in the formation in 1927 of the Society for Space Travel, of which the scientist Wernher von Braun was a member. Von Braun was a true genius. Within a few years, he would also go on to invent the infamous V2 rocket, or pronounced in German, the V2 rocket, that stunned the Allies, and then he would also go on to become the head of the Saturn V rocket project at NASA that sent men to the moon. In 1928, however, the Society produced the world's first rocket-powered automobile, the Opel RAK-1, developed together with Fritz von Opel, after whom the Opel car company is named. We flash forward to 1933 when Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany, and almost instantly the Nazi Party took command of all rocket and aircraft development, with all astronautical and aviation-related societies being nationalized and Naziified. This was done very deliberately. Even in the 1930s, Hitler and his henchmen were convinced that it would be the cutting-edge technology, including spacecraft, that would allow the Third Reich to rule the world. Wunderwaffe. That's the German for wonder weapon, and it was the name given by the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda to a series of superweapons that the Nazis believed would allow Germany to secure victory and reign supreme over the Allies. It was a very real, potent belief by the Nazi top brass, which is why so much effort went into technologies that were undoubtedly way ahead of their time. In fact, Wunderwaffen was in everything from boats to guns to even trains were already being experimented on in the 1930s. Aviation technology was at the forefront of this push to validate the Nazi claim of Germans as the master race at the helm of the so-called Thousand-Year Reich. Martin Bormann, a loyal aide to Hitler, was known to have ordered the careful mapping of all mountain passes, caves, bridges and highways in which the Reich and beyond operated. This included parts of Bavaria and Germany, as well as Austria and northern Italy. That was in 1938. The purpose? The selection of top-secret sites for underground factories with gigantic workshops and launch pads, known as U-plants. Germany's top scientists would toil in these Behemoth research labs and factories deep underground with one single goal: the development and production of a powerful, secret weapon. A slave labor contingency numbering 250,000 prisoners would complete work on these subterranean fortress-like labs, factories and launch pads, many of which would be linked by massive networks of tunnels and trains. Some of these wonder weapons would have been well documented and known prototypes, even working examples made of them. Others were more shrouded in mystery and even being debunked by some analysts as being pure propaganda myth. The Nazi UFOs are firmly in the latter group. No definitive Nazi UFO craft was ever seized, photographed, or in official use in the war. However, the allegations and conjecture around Nazi UFO craft are immense, and there is no denying that they certainly fit into the mold of what would have been a Nazi wonder weapon. It's believed by some that the Nazis had already perfected some form of circular-shaped aircraft designs just before the war. It was in 1939 that Heinrich Fokker, an aviation pioneer and co-founder of the Focke-Wulf Aircraft Company, was issued with a patent for a saucer-shaped craft with enclosed twin rotors. The craft's power system was described in the patent as follows. The exhaust nozzle was forked in two at the end of the engine and ended in two auxiliary combustion chambers located on the trailing edge of the wing. When fuel is added to these combustion chambers, it will act as afterburners to provide horizontal propulsion to Fokke's design. The control at low speed is achieved by alternatively varying the power from each auxiliary combustion chamber. Then there was the various codenames or subclassifications designated by the Nazis to a number of secret aircraft projects that strongly suggest that something circular and even otherworldly was being developed. Okay, now please remember, excuse my somewhat rusty German.
Buongiorno.
So here goes a list of names that were code for top secret aircraft projects. Rundflugzeug, Feuerball, Diskus, Haunebu Gerät, Frill, Kugelblitz, Andronergerät, Flugkreisel, Kugelwaffe, Jenseitsflugmaschine, Reichsflugschreiber, to name a few. Now, if you're German or you understand how German words are pronounced and you think I've done a pretty good job, I would love for you to hit that subscribe button. Even if you think I've done a terrible job, a subscription would really help boost my morale after getting through that, and you can wait till the credits to hear my first attempt. But all of this does beg the question, why all those codenames if not for something that strongly suggests a UFO type craft was being developed or at least considered? And then there was Victor Schauberger, a fascinating man who was both a scientist and environmentalist. It was alleged after the war that the Austrian scientist had been involved in the production of UFO-type craft, and that he even flew one near Prague in Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia in 1945. Schauberger's son later claimed that his father 1934, who was said to be fascinated by the scientist's obsession with harmonizing propulsion with how it works in nature. Schauberger's UFO was a prototype known as the Beluzzo Schliever Meter Discus. It was 6.7 meters or 22 feet in diameter and could supposedly travel at 2,000 kilometers or 1,242 miles per hour, with plans for it to go twice as fast as that. The craft could also reach 40,000 feet or 12,000 meters in less than 3 minutes. It's been further alleged that the Italians were assisting the Nazis with their experimental craft at the Fiat experimental facility at Lake La Garda in northern Italy. In 1950, Professor Giuseppe Beluzzo, an engineer who had been an economics minister under Mussolini and whose name was given to the Schauberger craft, stated in an interview that the Italians Beluzzo claimed that the craft could take off vertically and then fly horizontally by what he termed a spinning force. During the war, it is believed that the Allied intelligence uncovered work on Project Fireball at Germany's Luftwaffe Experimental Center in Bavaria. Specifically, the Germans were trying to create an aerial device that would confuse Allied radar and, critically, be able to interrupt electromagnetic currents. These efforts were well underway by 1944, but further intelligence is said to have revealed that work suddenly shifted in that year to the development of the Kugelblitz, or round lightning craft. It is said to be a circular aircraft that was unlike any previous craft in aviation history, and that had to be the Nazi UFO craft. The timing is actually quite interesting. You see, by 1944, Nazi Germany knew it was losing the war against the Allies. The Nazis were desperate, and desperate times call for desperate measures. Is it such a stretch to imagine that they would have resorted to an extreme resorted to an extreme. Were particularly eager to snatch up as much as they could of Nazi technology at the end of World War II. They wanted to do so before the Soviets did the same as they rapidly advanced from the east. Reconnaissance teams were sent in by the US Army even before Germany was actually defeated. There have been claims that what they encountered were plans by the Nazis regarding UFO-shaped and ground factories located in the Black Forest discovered a number of documents describing experiments by the Nazis regarding turbine engine technology with extraordinary power. Whatever the Allies saw as they scoured German plants certainly freaked them out. Sir Roy Fedden, chief of the technical mission to Germany for the British Ministry of Aircraft Production, stated this in 1945 about Germany's aviation projects. "I have seen enough of their designs and production plans to realize that if they had managed to prolong the war some months longer, developments in air warfare." Years later in 1956, Captain Ruppelt, chief of the US Air Force Project Blue Book, was more specific about what the Allies encountered. When World War II ended, the Germans had several radical types of aircraft and guided missiles under development. The majority were in the most preliminary stages, but they were the only known craft that could even approach the performance of objects reported to UFO observers. Canadian intelligence agents found plans for an advanced circular aircraft when they ransacked the main Nazi rocket experimental complex used near the end of the war. The Canadian intelligence agencies challenged scientists at de Havilland Aircraft Company to make something from the plans. It's alleged that they were actually able to produce a so-called flying saucer prototype, and it even flew, albeit very briefly. Engineers were simply unable to master the propulsion system needed to keep the aircraft airborne for a sustained amount of time. Those scientists would go on to work on the Avro Aerocar for the US Air Force and US Army respectively, although again, propulsion and stability proved to be a problem and the project was abandoned. Is the Canadian connection a true story or yet another Nazi UFO myth? One cannot be known for sure, but it's cracking stuff. Of course, I can't avoid them when doing a video on Nazi UFO aircraft. It gets downright bizarre. For example, there were many claims that the Nazis were in fact using alien technology. And by alien, I mean visitors from other worlds. This is not the ramblings of a crackpot, but in the words of leading German scientist Hermann Oberth, who has been called the father of the modern rocket, strongly hinted at this when he once said, "We cannot take credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped." When asked who exactly helped the Nazis, he replied, "The peoples of other worlds." Ivan von Braun, remember him, the guy who designed the Saturn V rockets, has been quoted as strongly suggesting that other powers were at play during many of the technological breakthroughs of the 1940s and 1950s. Both of these people were brilliant men of science, so why would they make such statements if there was no truth to them? It's even been suggested that the clear evidence of a UFO crash and a cover-up by the US military was in fact a flying saucer developed by the US, hence the huge cover-up. And from where did the Americans get the technology? You guessed it, from plans obtained after the war of the Nazi German UFO craft. And let's not forget the Foo Fighters that were famously observed by Allied pilots in November of 1944. Although dismissed by the military and experts alike as optical illusions caused by aerial disorientation, many Allied pilots insist on what they encountered. These pilots claim that they were followed by disc-shaped craft capable of awesome maneuvers that glowed orange or silver and could never, ever be outrun in the air. So if what the pilots witnessed was true, what were those craft? Alien UFOs or Nazi UFOs? The list of conspiracies linked to Nazi UFOs goes on, including everything from secret bunkers under the ice in Antarctica to even Nazi UFO stations on the dark side of the moon. Iron side of the moon. Suspected Allied military men divulged that the Nazis were developing a UFO-type craft, and statements by acclaimed German scientists suggest the technology was even alien. There may be a lot benunkum attached to the whole issue of whether or not there were even Nazi UFOs, but one thing is for sure, however, some of the allegations are undoubtedly very compelling. And it's up to you sitting there at home if you choose to believe. Speaking of belief, I believe that you sitting right there and now would love to follow Found and Explained on the following social medias. Jump onto Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok to follow one of your favorite aviation channels. That's me. And also, if you want to talk to other fans of the channel, we have a Discord where you can jump on, chat to me, and even suggest topics for future videos. And if you want to join the Found and Explained family, we have channel memberships and Patreon, which you can click on to see videos early and appear in the lovely credits just like these people. Rundflugzeugen Fleuerbu Diskus Haunibu Geräte Adromenende Gerät Flugkreisel Kugelwaffel Jensatzflugmaschine Reichsflugscheibe Guggenheimer. I can't do this. This is insane. Are you serious? These names of... Welcome to Found and Explained, ladies and gentlemen. It's late 1944 and Hitler has a problem. The entry of the United States a few years earlier in its previous Lend-Lease program has greatly changed the landscape of the war, and not in Germany's favor. The Nazis have found themselves on the back foot and they needed a way to knock the US out of the war, and quick. That's where the America Bomber Project comes in. While there were many different concepts proposed, from giant propeller planes to flying wings, it was actually this last one that was truly the most epic for the time and the most insane. A space rocket plane that could fly 160 kilometers above the Earth and theoretically bomb anywhere at any time. It would have been impossible to stop, and with the right weapon, wipe New York off the map. This is the incredible tale of the nearly built, the Silverbird. A space plane at the time was a radically new idea, completely changing flight that had been previously pioneered. For example, this Silverbird wouldn't have even taken off from a runway. Instead, it would first power up along a 3-kilometer long track with a rocket engine caboose to push the main craft up to 1,930 kilometers per hour before going airborne. So this is seriously the fastest train ever built at this point. Then once the main aircraft was airborne, it would fire its own onboard rocket engine to climb up to an altitude of 145 kilometers. Yes, that's 90 miles straight up, or 450,000 feet. At this point, it's a rocket ship traveling at 21,800 kilometers per hour, which would have broken several speed records all at the same time in the name of conquest. But the really interesting part is what happens next. Now, the Silverbird would start to glide back towards Earth and slowly start to re-enter the atmosphere, particularly the stratosphere. The increasing air density would slowly increase the friction on the bottom of the aircraft and, in turn, generate lift. The result would be something only described as a bounce, as the aircraft's speed would rapidly translate into lift and higher altitude, causing the Silverbird to once again rise out of the Earth's sky. This process could be repeated again, with the bounce translating into a longer distance traveled. Now, energy can't be created from nothing, and each bounce would be smaller than the one before, but the scientists believed that this range extension would be enough to get it over the Atlantic and complete its mission. Dropping a whopping 4,000 kilo bomb on New York. Now, the exact nature of this mega bomb is unknown, but we do know that the Nazis were on the cusp of figuring out the nuclear option, and if the war had dragged on for longer and this project went ahead, it could have been possible that this aircraft carried nukes on board. The Silverbird, now victorious, would continue to bounce and may have even had enough altitude to cruise over the northern Pacific to drop down somewhere in Japan-controlled China. The crew would then be taken back to Germany for another mission by conventional means, with the Silverbird being packed up and transported by rail. A total journey of 19,000 to 24,000 kilometers all around the Earth. All thanks to the brilliant design of this aircraft. The Silverbird was effectively a 100-ton space plane with 90 tons of fuel, 5 tons for life support, and another 4 for armament. The front, expected to deal with the vast heat load on re-entry, was not a window, but a television. At least some sort of proposed film projector of some description that worked through a rudimentary periscope to give the pilot quite the view of the Earth. The pilot's cabin would be for one, and it would be pressurized. They would have a storage area for food and water for the long-haul trip, but not many other comforts. The cabin would also be surrounded by coolant tubes in order to ensure effective heat management. Otherwise, it would have been an oven on board. The bomb bay behind the pilot would have had room for 4,000 kilos of weapons, and each bomb could be controlled via remote television to its destination. The accuracy and the technology required was doubted, but the Nazis were pretty happy that the bomb would land somewhere in the region of 400 miles to its destination. There would also be a tricycle landing gear that would be used when it arrived in Japan, and the space plane would also have a simple flight control surface to steer it as it came in. Now, in my notes, I couldn't exactly find any sort of parachute system or ejection system for the pilot, so you gotta believe that the pilot was very brave to get on board. But perhaps not as brave as the man who came up with the idea. Our story of this madness actually begins back in 1942, when the Nazis needed to figure out a solution to their age-old enemy, the Atlantic Ocean. America, who had just entered the war, had its industrial base located far away from the front lines over the sea, and the Nazis needed a way for their planes to get there. The Nazis dubbed this program the America Bomber and issued a notice to their top engineers and aircraft firms to come up with a new aircraft that was up to the task of this savage mission. But it's not our gang of usual suspects like Messerschmitt or Junkers that are the center of attention this time round, but rather a rocket scientist by the name of Eugene Sanger. Sanger was a brilliant rocket scientist who had previously rose to fame before the war with his theories of using rockets to punch through the atmosphere. His work was so prolific that he was alike to von Braun and was recruited into the same Nazi war machine. Ironically, this would become a deep rivalry, but we'll get to that later. During the development of various V1 prototypes, such as the A7, he realized that if the rocket entered the Earth's atmosphere at a specific angle, it would bounce off the increasing atmosphere, much like a pebble does off the surface of a lake. And perhaps even those bounces could be translated into further distance, the very basis of the Silverbird. With this idea, in December 1941, Sanger sent his proposal for the suborbital glider to the RLM under the proposal of rocket propulsion for long-range bombers, seeking a substantial sum to build a prototype. Alas, the 900-page proposal was regarded with disfavor from RLM due to its size and complexity, and the fact that the war was heating up in a bad way for Germany. The powers that be parked his proposal. They needed results yesterday, and were looking for a new type of aircraft to simply win them the war. But that didn't dissuade Sanger, and he went back to the drawing board. Working with his wife, who was also a famous rocket scientist called Irene Brett, they worked around the clock and came up with a workable 400-page plan of a rocket plane, the Silverbird that we know today. They set it out to all the famous Nazi names: von Braun, Messerschmitt, Heisenberg, Focke-Wulf, Heinkel, and Professor Dorner himself. The report detailed 2 manned and 1 unmanned version, and they were called the Antipodal Long-Range Glider and the Intercontinental Long-Range Glider, and I'll let you pronounce those names in German back at home. The report was so controversial that the German government hid it from everyone without top secret clearance and put it in a safe under guard for 24 hours a day. It seemed like only a moment was wasted before they got to work to build this proposal. Well, not really. What happened? You see, by 1945, the war was going pretty poorly for Nazi Germany, and Sanger and his fellow rocket scientists realized that it would be better to delay the launch of these new superweapons rather than complete them haphazardly. While working on various ramjet engines, Sanger and Brett were moved deep into the Alps, where one day they simply stood up from their workshop, walked out together over a mountain pass and into the waiting arms of the US troops, effectively defecting in order to avoid the approaching Soviets. And speaking of the Soviets, that report that they wrote that was 400 pages long a year before would very quickly come back to haunt them. The Russians managed to raid several aircraft factories by this point of the war and acquired the document detailing Sanger's proposal. Stalin quickly grew very interested and requested a meeting with his secret police and the Politburo. In part, they discussed while the V2 design captured from von Braun was interesting, it didn't have the range to attack anyone but Poland. They would need something like the Silverbird to combat America. And in order to build this Russian version, why not get the team that was going to build the Nazi one? Sanger and Brett. Stalin made his mission such a top priority that he sent his son and several agents to France to track them down. Eugene Sanger and Irene Brandt had both been recruited by the French Air Ministry to develop a supersonic fighter, and thus were protected by French counterintelligence. In a stroke of luck, the French managed to hear about this plot beforehand and moved them both at midnight, hiding them away in a farmhouse as the Soviets sought in vain for their location. And in a twist of fate, around about this point, it actually turns out that Sanger and Irene had feelings for each other. I'm not actually making this up, and this is me jumping in during the edit to change this, but I read about that they actually ended up getting married and falling in love, which is absolutely kind of a nice, wonderful spin on a story about a Nazi death machine. Developments in jet engines from this point, and the creation of the ICBM eventually made Stalin forget about the project, saving Sanger and Irene's life. Sanger would eventually return to the new Western Germany, where he and his wife would work on various space developments, and even came up with the idea of solar sails to visit other stars. A legend for sure. As for the Silverbird, the work wouldn't go to waste, and eventually its concepts were implemented in the space shuttle for NASA. So the question that you must have at the edge of your lips after watching this last 11 minutes and 49 seconds is, would have the Silverbird actually worked for Nazi Germany? Well, kind of. You see, the post-war analysis of the Silbervogel design involved a mathematical control analysis unearthed a computational error. It turns out that the heat flow during the initial atmospheric re-entry, the first bounce, was much greater than calculated by Sanger and Brett. Hence, if the design had actually been constructed, it would have been utterly destroyed by the heat, which would have exceeded the design limits and melted the craft. Of course, the problem could have been solved and removed by augmentating the heat shield, much like that we saw with the space shuttle, but this would have reduced the craft's payload capacity significantly, reducing its use for the intended mission of destroying distant areas. So it's very possible, whilst they could have created a rocket ship spaceplane, it would have only been used for science. which is not really a shame because I think that's the best use of this technology. So as it turns out, it was hardly the doomsday weapon that they all thought, and had it been built, it would have been a total waste of resources for the Nazis, which I think at the end of the day is a fantastic end to this tale. Thanks so much for watching. Among many late war-mad Nazi designs, there is this one that was probably the craziest. It was not just then a state-of-the-art jet bomber, but one with forward-swept wings that could outrun any Allied fighter. And was so good that it secured an order of 500 of them to save Hitler's Third Reich. Let's explore the story behind the Junkers bomber that had one of the most interesting legacies in the history of aviation, and answer the question, what if? The issue that plagued most German bombers during World War II is that their counterparts were simply much better in payload capacity. The heaviest German bombers of World War II, the Heinkel 177 Greif, was behind both the Avro Lancaster and the B-29, with its maximum payload being around 7,000 kilograms. By comparison, the Lancaster had 10,000 kilos and the B-29 with a whopping 12,000 kilograms respectively. A far cry from the idea that every Nazi aircraft was better in every way. But by pioneering jet engine technology in the late stages of the war, it opened the door to a whole new bunch of crazy and very fast aircraft. But no idea was more exciting to the Nazis than that of the perfect bomber. One that would be able to deliver massive amount of ordnance, outrun and outmaneuver Allied fighters, and if produced in large enough numbers, maybe stop the enemy advance on one front and allow the Germans to focus on the other, and perhaps even turn the tide of war. An impossible mission for the engineers, one might say, but there was this one trick up their sleeves, and it had to do with inverting the wings. Forward-swept wing design is an interesting concept, dating even before the start of World War II with the Soviet Belyaev DBLK. Around the same time, a German airplane designer called Hans Wacke was also working on the same concept, studying the regular swept wing design issue with early jet engines, namely how they did not provide enough lift at subsonic speeds. Forward-swept wings would allow for extra lift during takeoff with these early jet engines, help greatly with the maneuverability of the aircraft, increase the maximum speed due to lower drag, and allow for a larger payload capacity. The perfect solution, right? Well, it's not that easy. Although correct, there was one critical issue that the Germans kept coming up to with this wing design. During any maneuvers, extreme stress would be applied on the outer area of the wings and warp them in the opposite direction. A maneuver such as a dogfight. Materials such as aluminium, or aluminum for my North American friends, was one of the most advanced materials in use during that time, but it still couldn't handle this amount of stress. Meaning, forward-swept wings would never work with a fighter, but they might just work with a bomber. Now, the biggest advantage that they would get with this type of wing design is a huge single bomb bay, and it could be located in the perfect spot in the fuselage, the center of gravity. This was thanks to the root of the wing spar being further back compared to the normal wing design. So in 1944, the first prototype was completed, and to say that it was a Frankenstein plane would be an understatement. This project as a whole, although prospective, was just an aerodynamical testbed at the time of development, which leads to its Frankenplane point. The first U-287V1 was made out of, well, other planes. The fuselage was donated by the He-177 the tail section from the U-188, the main landing gear from the U-352, and here comes the best part, the front landing gear section was from a shot-down B-24 Liberator. Talk about using your enemy's tools against them. The engines for this prototype were the UMO 004, the same one used in the Me-262. 2 of them in nacelles under the wings and another 2 in the front section of the fuselage. The landing gear was not retractable, and this would make it the only jet bomber in the world with such a feature. However, cover would be added around the wheels to eliminate extra drag, a similar solution to what was done on the famous Stuka. In August of 1944, flight testing started and the results were very promising. But the design was just about to receive some major upgrades. After experiencing the aforementioned issues with the wing warping, the Germans found a workaround with moving all of the engines under the wings and slightly forward, making a balance mass big enough to eliminate some of the stress on the wing construction. The U-287V2 would receive 2 clusters of 3 engines on the wings. It was a combination of the UMO 004 and BMW 003. These engines were actually used on the He-162 fighters in the late war, so let me know if you'd like a video on that as well. Apart from these changes, the second prototype also had a pressurized cockpit from the U-288 and a completely new tail section. The design ticked pretty much all of the requirements, and the only thing they still needed were the brand new engines to give this jet some real power. Oh, did I mention that they were going for almost a supersonic speed? The idea was to outrun any Allied fighters at the time, and a top speed that they were looking for was around 850 kilometers per hour, which these new engines would provide in spades. Although they never actually got them in time, obviously, a top speed of still 660 kilometers was achieved during testing of this bomber, which is more than any Allied counterpart could do. The third, fourth, and fifth prototype were built, but the development was suddenly brought to a halt in 1944. The project sat idle for some time, although Junkers was allowed to continue testing the V1 prototype until around the beginning of 1945. But in March of the same year, they suddenly received an order for 500 planes with a planned production of 100 per month, out of nowhere. Now, put yourself in Junkers' shoes. It's been nearly a year since you seriously worked on this concept, and the order from the bunker was alarming at best. Was this some type of joke or a serious plan? Unfortunately, we'll never know, but only a month later, the Soviets would capture the production facilities in Dachau, and along with them, the whole team developing the aircraft. And you know that this wasn't the end of the story. The V1 and V2 prototypes were destroyed to prevent capture as the Soviets advanced, but the V3 and V4, the ones intended as serial production aircraft, were captured and transferred to the Soviet Union. Having all of the engineers, documentation, and prototypes, the Soviets started developing their own forward-swept wing bomber called the EF-131. A larger EF-140 bomber soon followed with only 2 engines, because jet development was going very fast, pun intended, and there was no need for multiple engines anymore. However, the project was stopped in 1950s with the team shifted to more contemporary jet projects. The legacy of this design still goes on though in both Germany, Russia, and the US. The German concept was led by none other than Fokker himself, who would go on to develop the only forward-swept wing commercial aircraft, the HFB-320 Hansa-Jet. The Americans developed the X-49, and the Soviets, and later on the Russians, developed the Su-47. We already have a video about this nutty Soviet design on the channel, so go check it out if you want to. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon on another crazy aircraft adventure. If you're a Captain America fan, then you might remember the aircraft that Red Skull used to escape the hero. Well, today we'll talk all about it, because that's right, this thing was almost built. Tail-sitter designs was something tried over and over again throughout the history by both Americans, Soviets, even the French, but of course it was the Germans that would try this concept first, and it was none other than the legendary Focke-Wulf Bureau who tried to build a working tail-sitter aircraft back in World War II. Jump aboard and get ready to take off without a runway with the Focke-Wulf Triebflügel. The idea behind tail-sitter aircraft is credited to none other than Nikola Tesla. He actually patented the design in 1920, but never got around to seeing his concept materialized. But in 1944, the Nazis decided to have a go. You see, Nazi Germany wasn't in a good position. With the D-Day on the Western Front and the Soviets pushing hard on the East, the end was inevitable, and they needed a miracle to win, or at least stop one side and consolidate their troops on the other front. This led to the birth of some pretty imaginative projects, some of which we've covered and some that we'll be covering in the future, but this one was very distinct and weird. Focke-Wulf funded internally a new interceptor aircraft project that was to be made of cheap materials, used cheap fuel like hydrogen, and could be mass produced to defend strategic areas or factories which had no runways nearby, in a bid to save the German industry and turn the tide of war. The Triebflügel was a completely new design, one that threw away any previous aircraft design philosophy and went wild with the forces of gravity. The aircraft was to be VTOL capable, powered by two different propulsion groups. The main one was made out of 3 ramjet engines mounted on the tip of the propeller like wings below the cockpit. But ramjets are actually a terrible choice for a VTOL aircraft, as they can't move anything from standstill. Ramjets only provide propulsion whilst they're flying in flight because of the air entering the nozzle by the forward motion. They don't do anything when they're just sitting on the tarmac. So the other type of engine on board would be a rocket, jet, or a propeller engine that would be used to simply give the aircraft enough power to lift off so that the ramjets could be activated. In flight, the ring, which the propeller blade-like wings with engines were mounted on, would rotate, and basically a large propeller would then push the aircraft upwards and then forwards. That's right, the wings themselves would actually become the propeller. The aft section was made out of 4 tailplanes fitted with a steering surface in the role of both ailerons and rudders. Very similar to the Convair Pogo and the Sukhoi Shkval, which you can check out on the channel. Each of the tail stabilizers had a small landing gear, and the main one was located in the center. It was to carry the weight of the aircraft, with the others to provide stability when landing. But how would the pilot actually steer this thing? After the takeoff, the engines used to provide initial power would be turned off, and the large spinning propeller with the ramjets would then push the aircraft upwards to a certain altitude, where the pilot would slowly pitch the aircraft forward before getting into a horizontal position. From there, it's easy, right? Well, to put it simply, it's not. The pilot would have to fly with the nose pitched slightly upwards to provide lift, and because, remember, there are no wings, and that's why the weaponry was actually mounted pitched slightly downwards. So it would be pretty much doing a wheelie in the sky. On the topic of the weaponry, since it was made to be an interceptor, it would presumably have to fight against Allied bombers and other large targets. It would carry 2 30mm and 2 20mm guns, and that would be some serious firepower for an interceptor. There was no need for other smaller caliber cannons or machine guns against fighters because it was essentially a flying brick, although a pretty fast one because during wind tunnel testings the Germans deduced that speeds around Mach 0.9 could be achieved, which is frankly ludicrous. Whilst it sounded a bit like a mess, all of this so far was rather viable and the project continued forward. That is until they started to look at the landings. Unlike the future tail-setter designs, this one wouldn't have a rotating seat for the pilot to be able to look over his shoulder when he came into land. This would mean that the pilot would be facing upwards during both takeoff and landing, and his visibility would be extremely bad, especially with that ramjet-powered propeller thing spinning like crazy right behind him. But this was still enough for the project to reach those wind tunnel tests. What happened next? Another thing that we said in this video is the project was funded internally by Focke-Wulf, meaning the Luftwaffe didn't even have plans or requirements set for this aircraft, and even if Focke-Wulf presented it, there's a high chance that they would have rejected it immediately, because of the over-complicated design and the need for new training programs for the pilots of this insane aircraft. And would you really want to risk those few skilled pilots that you had left on an experimental death trap machine? Perhaps not. And there you have it. In an alternative reality, Hydra got the plans for this and would actually build this aircraft for Red Skull. So if anybody watching right now knows somebody at Disney or Marvel and they need some help with their 3D animations, tell them to give me a call. Thanks for watching, and please do subscribe for more interesting videos. And if you want to support me on Patreon, the link is in the description below. And as the Germans would say, Auf Wiedersehen. Near the end of World War II, the Nazis came up with a radically new idea for a fighter plane. One that was powered by jet engines. This new technology could perhaps give the Nazis the edge against the Allied air forces and maybe even win them the war. Flying just below supersonic and piloted by the best German aces, the Me-262 would be unstoppable. There was simply nothing to match this Wunderwaffe. But Hitler's decisions and wrong expectations stopped this jet from turning the tide of war. This is the story of the first jet fighter, the Messerschmitt 262. Ironically, our story begins with the Treaty of Versailles. You see, this unfair treaty, in air quotes, was to blame for the rise of German jet development. After World War I, this treaty was signed banning Germans from further development of piston engines. But there was no talk about new technologies like using rocket or jet engines. This pushed the German engineers into a direction of creating an alternative yet superior type of fighter plane. Heinkel was the first to start working on his design along with von Ohain with his He-178, which was the first turbojet aircraft to take to the skies just a week before the kickoff of World War II. On the other hand, British engineer Frank Whittle had also worked on a jet engine as a new propulsion method, but the British government didn't take him seriously at the time. And this gave the Germans a big advantage. After the war started and initial German successes, RLM, or the Nazi Ministry of Aviation, shifted their focus to aircraft they already had in service instead of working on this new jet technology. Because, well, if it works, why change it? However, Heinkel pushed forward with his design, building the He-280, but Willy Messerschmitt also took interest in this new jet engine technology, and soon enough, he proposed a new fighter known as Project 1065, just before the war started. You see, both Heinkel and Messerschmitt were brilliant engineers, but Heinkel didn't know how to play by the rules and didn't have the political backing the same way Messerschmitt did. This resulted in Hitler himself being impressed with this new jet technology, giving Messerschmitt essentially carte blanche in accepting any design that he could guarantee to be a feasible one. By 1942, the Me-262 had its first flight, and in 1943, legendary ace Adolf Golland flew the aircraft himself, being impressed by the performance and stating, "This is not a step forward, this is a leap forward." Everything was set for this new jet to become the backbone of the Luftwaffe, and let the Nazi Empire to strike back stronger than ever before. The most fascinating part of the Me-262 was its design. It was very ahead of its time. Its requirements stated that it needed to reach a speed of 850 km per hour, but actually doing service, pilots reported that they surpassed 900 km per hour. The wings were swept back 18.5 degrees to move the center of gravity and accommodate large and heavy jet engines in pods under the wings. Also, they would allow for lower drag and a better maximum speed. On the downside, however, this swept wing design had issues at lower speeds, especially on takeoff, which would allow Allies to exploit it later, but I'll get back to that in a minute. It was armed with 4 30mm Mk108 cannons, which would allow it for downing pretty much any bomber or plane in a single burst. Propulsion would be provided by 2 turbojet Junkers 004 engines, and they would be the first operational axial compressor engines in the world. However, they would also become one of the main issues for this jet fighter. The first variant of the jet was called the Schwalbe, or Swallow, was a fighter interceptor, and this was exactly what it was designed to do. But things started to unravel when Messerschmitt showed off this prototype fighter to the big bad himself. Hitler had other plans which would prove to be one of the fatal issues for the future of the Me-262 program, and perhaps even the loss of German airspace itself. With the imminent Allied invasion of France, Hitler thought that the best role for this new wonder weapon would be fast deep strikes into Allied territory, dropping bombs over France and perhaps even into England. Although it was completely a stupid idea, especially for a fighter jet, not a bomber aircraft, Messerschmitt still went with it and ordered fighter production to be drastically reduced and a new bomber version to be designed. This new variant was called the, and again I'm really trying here, the Sturmvogel, or Stormbird, and it was developed but completely blocked the future development of the fighter variant. And this is when all the issues started to pop up and the engineers weren't around to fix them. D-Day arrived and the Germans were unable to stop the Allies on the ground, nor build this new attack variant in time, and that's when Hitler got mad.
Nein, 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 nein!
In his rage, he issued a direct order to completely stop any fighter production and instead just pump out the attack bomber variant. In spite of that, the Luftwaffe started training pilots on the previously delivered fighters, and they were to be piloted by the very best of the best. Conversion from a FW-190 or BF-109 to a Me-262 was not a hard task because the Me-262 was a very capable and flyable aircraft. However, it was easy for the aces, but manpower was the actual issue in 1944. Young pilots without too much experience were getting put into this brand new jet fighter because they didn't have anybody else. And the result went pretty much as expected. Many pilots were killed in all sorts of crazy accidents during training, and then they would be going up against the best Allied pilots who had plenty of real-world experience. But eventually these rookies got into fighter squadrons and were actually deployed on the battlefield. At first, the Me-262 was an absolute game changer. The Allies didn't even know what hit them. It was successful against fighters, bombers, and pretty much anything. But soon enough, the Allied pilots would start to use a new tactic to counter this threat, and this became a huge thorn in the design of the aircraft. You see, the main issue with the Junkers UMO 004 engines were the materials it was built out of. Because of the blockade and the inability to acquire rare and expensive materials, they were built out of steel which could not handle either the heat or the wear and tear in an anaxial compression engine. The Germans knew that nickel alloy was to be the solution, but the only problem is they couldn't access it. So these engines were plagued with reliability problems and would have to be frequently serviced even in the heat of battle. Another problem was that the production itself. The factories were constantly bombed by both the Soviets and Allies, and they would actually have to move the production of the Me-262 to tunnels, underground facilities, and even forests, where they would have to assemble the aircraft by hand. But in spite of all these issues, over 1,400 were built by the end of the war. A lot, but not nearly enough to change anything on the front lines. It turns out that there were several design flaws that would be the ace in the hole in its destruction. Allied fighter pilots would find out that the best way to counter the Me-262 was during takeoff or landing. As these planes were rising up to the sky, they would not be able to gain speed fast enough, meaning their main advantage was out. Many were also destroyed on the ground because raids were focused on airfields where these jets were spotted during recon missions. They decided to hit them hard on the ground before they could get up to speed. Whilst in the sky, inexperienced pilots would often make mistakes and it would cost them their lives. And American pilots flying P-51s found out that if they could somehow get into a dive or a downward spiral with the Me-262 during a dogfight, they would be able to catch up with it. But this wasn't the only issue with the plane. As the war ended in May of 1945, many Me-262s were left all around Germany, and they were the top prize for both the Americans, British, and Soviets to further develop their own aircraft. Many late 40s and other jet pioneer designs would be based off experiences with the Me-262, and although that it never had an impact on the war itself, it entered history as the first operational jet fighter, legendary and a beautiful design that we can still admire today. I'll be covering more crazy Nazi designs in the future, so don't forget to comment about what you would like to see, and thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next Found and Explained video. It's April 1945. An unknown aircraft is flying low and fast just above the trees. French ace Pierre Clostermann, leading a formation of 4 Hawker Tempests, is going in for a kill. He's sure that the Tempests can get him, and it's 4 versus 1. But then the German pilot accelerates, and in a few seconds, he is out of their reach. This wasn't a Me-262 nor a jet aircraft. How could he have escaped so fast? Today we'll be exploring the story of the fastest piston aircraft the Nazis ever built, the Dornier 335 Pfeil. Claude Dornier was a German aircraft designer and engineer known for his unusual, although some might say weird designs. But he would actually gain his fame with the usual, more typical aircraft that we know, such as the Do-17, which was one of the main German light bombers in the early war, and the Do-24, one of the most famous seaplanes ever built. But his unusual side of projects is the most interesting and right up Found and Explain alley. He was experimenting way before World War II with this new concept of aircraft called push-pull engines on his Do-J and Do-XC planes. This propulsion method would combine two engines, and such as the name suggests, one would push the aircraft from behind and the other one would pull from the front. Whilst this concept had been done before, the trick that he came up with was to eliminate the extra drag created with separate engines in either pods or gondolas. And this is exactly the principle that would make the Do 335 possible. When the war was already in its full wake, the RLM, or German Aviation Ministry, which has such a complex German name that I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, made a request for a new Schnellbomber, translated as fast bomber, a light enough aircraft to strike fast and deep behind enemy lines, and also get away with the pilot still intact. Dornier would propose his Project 231 aircraft based on the P-59 design, which was developed as early as 1940, but he was shut down by Göring himself. Despite beating the Ardo, Junkers and Blohm-und-Voss competitors and winning the contract for the aircraft under the name the 8335, it would run into some complications due to the war itself. He would be informed that the aircraft was no longer needed, and instead, the Luftwaffe was now looking for a fast multi-role aircraft which could perform both close air support and fighter missions. So it was back to the drawing board yet again. After redesigning the P-231, the Do 335 was finally born and got its suitable name, the File or Arrow. This aircraft was like no other in many different ways. It would be powered by two Daimler-Benz DB603 engines, 1700 horsepower beasts used for much of the bigger attack aircraft like the Me-410 or the He-219. This would give the new Do 335 immense power. They were located in the forward and aft section of the fuselage, with the aft one being used as a push and the forward one as the pull engine, which is pretty obvious by now. This engine placement will eliminate a lot of drag in flight, and in case of one engine failure, it would be relatively easy to control and land the plane, unlike traditional double-engine planes of the era. But let's talk about guns. The armament consisted of one 30mm Mk103 cannon mounted in the nose and a further two MG 151 20mm autocannons, certainly enough to easily take down any Allied bomber or fighter. Apart from that, the weapons bay could also fit up to 1,000 kilos of bombs for its multi-role mission profile. Unlike other fighters at the time, the Do 335 had a very high ground clearance, and you could walk below the aircraft, which had a modern tricycle retractable landing gear. This was due to the very large propellers on the DB603 engines. This would be one of its weak spots, but we'll get to that in a minute. Below the tail section was a large ventricle fin that could be used for both added stability in flight and to protect the rear propeller from the ground in case of a hard landing. And here's the most interesting part: the Do 335 featured an ejection seat. With a maximum speed of 760 km per hour, faster than a P-51 Mustang, Tempest or pretty much any other Allied plane, it would dominate the skies. Well, on paper. After completing flight tests, pilots were very happy with the performance of the aircraft and sang its praises. Apart from aircraft with jet engines, this was the fastest aircraft that had ever been built by Nazi Germany. It was stable in flight, easily maneuverable, and extremely powerful. But it did have some tiny teeny issues, such as the landing gear. For an aircraft of its size and weight, the landing gear was too weak and would be prone to breaking when the pilot came in hard. But this wouldn't stop the highest power in the land from taking notice. In 1944, and get ready for this word, let's see if I can do it right, The Jäger-Nord program, or emergency fighter program, was started, and Hitler himself gave maximum priority to the Do-335. He saw it as a super fighter and could save Germany from increasing Allied air attacks. The plan was simple: to have around 2,000 Do-335s built by the end of 1946, which we know now is very optimistic. Even He-219 was cancelled to give more production capabilities to this wonder plane. But the Allies bombed the main factory in Munich, and production would be set back by a lack of engine deliveries at this stage of the war. However, pilots were trained slowly and steadily with a specialized two-seater variant made for this role, and that's the one that we've got featured in the video today. Apart from the two-seater variant, there were also several more interesting designs based on the original Do-335 platform. In 1944, Junkers and Dornier cooperated on a Zwilling, or double fuselage variant called the Do-635. It would be used as a recon and spy plane, getting the interest from Japan. But by 1945, it was cancelled due to, well, both Germany and Japan being cancelled from the war itself. Another interesting proposal was a jet-powered P-256 armed with four 30mm cannons and powered by two Heinkel Hess 011 jet engines, the same ones that were used in the Junkers U-287 bomber, along with a radar. This would be the ultimate heavy fighter to take on Allied bombers or pretty much anything else. Lastly, there was also the Do-535 or He-535. There was another variant that was to be used by Heinkel with a single jet engine instead of a rear piston engine. And seemingly as an encore, there was also the Do-435 that was actually built as a high-altitude fighter interceptor with elongated wings, similar to the TA-152 design. So this platform was immensely flexible and very popular with all of the other German aerospace firms. All of this can confirm that the Germans had big plans for this airframe, just not enough time or resources. So how did the Do-335 perform in combat? Well, it just didn't. With only 37 built and flown by the war ended, they simply didn't have an opportunity to use it in combat, at least that's what records say. However, as Klosterman said, he did encounter one Do-335 in 1945, which managed to easily outrun him and his unit and was not shot down. We can only speculate, but it's highly likely that the Do-335 would perform well in combat, especially against Allied bombers like the Me-262 did in its initial encounters. Allies would have probably found a way to deal with this new threat at some point, just like they did with the other Nazi jets, but it certainly would have made heads scratch in London and Washington. The only surviving airframe had an interesting story as well. It was transferred by the Americans for testing just after the war ended, and then just rotted away for years before it was donated to a museum and then transferred back to the Dornier plant in 1974. Then it was completely refurbished, and some of the engineers and workers who were working there were actually some of the original ones who worked on the first aircraft. So it must have been quite a sight to see one of your original airframes back in the shop. For years it was located in the museum in Munich until being returned to the National Air and Space Museum in the US in 1988, where it stands to this day. So that's it, the story about one of the most interesting German aircraft from World War II. Definitely could have been a game changer if it was adopted in time and with proper resources. But just to make it clear, I'm very much glad that it wasn't. A running theme for prospective Nazi projects, I guess. Thanks so much for watching. Please check out the other Nazi projects on the channel and write down in the comments for your suggestions on what to cover next. Also, if not, consider subscribing for updates and new videos. During the waning hours of World War II, the Allies faced a new terror in the skies. It had twin engines, twin machine guns, and flew like nothing they had ever seen before. It was capable of flying faster than traditional planes, impossible to detect on radar, and would prove to be a winning hand for the defense of the Nazi state. But this alternative history never happened. The Ho-229 was a radical departure from modern aircraft design, and had it been rolled out, could have changed the outcome of the war, the way we design planes today, and even lead to something far more sinister. This is the original flying wing, the Horten 229. Since the dawn of aviation, one thing has been a dream concept for aircraft designers: a flying wing. This is an aircraft with no tail and that has no defined fuselage, essentially a wing as the entire aircraft. Crew, payload, fuel, and onboard equipment, all of it is housed within the main structure of the wing. Because that's all there is. After all, if you look at a typical aircraft, so much of its volume is wasted on areas that don't generate lift. As BBC Future noted in 2016, the flying wing design is not a common sight in the skies because it's an incredibly hard concept to make work. Remember, the main tail of any aircraft keeps it stable and prevents it from swerving or yawning from side to side. Therefore, a lack of tail makes the aircraft a lot harder to control. Even more of a challenge is what happens to an aircraft without a tail when its engine stops. That is, can it still fly during a stall? The ability to do that is an inherent capability that any aircraft has been able to do. So, why would you make a flying wing aircraft that is inherently difficult to fly? Because a flying wing has several benefits. For one thing, it is difficult to spot on a radar, since it has no tail fins that are what usually bounce the radar waves back to Earth. And for another, a flying wing is sleek and smooth in shape, which means it has minimal drag. That should make it a lot lighter and a lot more efficient than most fighter jets. And lastly, it should theoretically fly faster than a conventional plane using the same engine. The famous Northrop B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, first released in 1989, is a modern example of a flying wing aircraft. Before that, Northrop was working on a propeller bomber design called the XB-35 and later upgraded to the YB-49 with jet engines. But believe it or not, they were not the first. If you go back more than 4 decades before the B-2 stealth bomber was launched into the skies, you will have a far earlier plan for a flying wing, and a fairly stunning one at that. It was the Ho-229, and it was set to revolutionize the air force of a certain country fighting a certain major war at the time. So let's see, an aircraft with a revolutionary design we've never seen before? Check. Said aircraft developed at the tail end of World War II? Check. And under top secret development by a country which had started the war and was starting to lose it by then. Double check. Now, what country could that possibly be, and what possibly went wrong with the project? The country, of course, was none other than Nazi Germany. After all, no other country came close to Germany in exploring new and often highly unorthodox aviation designs during World War II. The Ho-229, or Horten HIX, was a Nazi prototype fighter bomber whose claim to fame was simple yet powerful. It was the first jet engine powered flying wing. The Horten Ho-229 was initially designed by brothers Reimar and Walter Horten and was to be mass produced at the... this is going to be a hard one to pronounce, guys, so hold on. Gute Wagenfabrik. Forgive me, anybody who speaks or understands German, for that horrible pronunciation. Okay, back to the show. Which was why the aircraft was also designated the Gothica Go 229. It should be noted that the original concept needed extensive redesign work done by Gothica in order for it to be primed for mass production, but we can't rule out the initial work done by the two designers. Walter and Reimar Horten had been designing aircraft since the early 1930s. At the time, Germany was still officially banned from having an air force due to the draconian terms of the Treaty of Versailles, signed after World War I. Sporting air clubs were set up all over Germany to overcome these restrictions by the Nazi Party, of which the Horten brothers were a part. It was those air clubs that became the foundation for Nazi Germany's air force, the Luftwaffe. It's been said that Reimar was a brilliant designer and Walter the audacious fighter pilot. Together, they made a formidable team. So how did these two brothers get chosen to design and build these top secret projects by the Nazi high command? They did so by winning a competition. That's right, it was actually Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, who in 1943 called for a light bomber design that would be capable of meeting the all-important 3 times 1,000 requirement. That is the ability for the craft to carry 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds of bombs to a distance of 1,000 kilometers at a speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour, and that's 620 miles per hour for both instances. However, only jet engines could provide that type of speed. Furthermore, jets were extremely fuel hungry, which made the range requirement of 1,000 kilometers particularly challenging. The Ho 229 flying wing was the only design submitted to Göring that even came close to the tough 3x1000 requirement that he'd set. And unsurprisingly, the Horten brothers' design was the one to receive Göring's final approval. He immediately allocated 500,000 Reichsmarks to the Horten brothers to get several prototypes built and flown as quickly as possible to turn the tide of war currently raging in Europe. The Horten Ho 229 was a sleek number, measuring 7.4 meters in length at its center line with a total wingspan of 16.8 meters. The Horten wing concept addressed the whole engine stall dilemma that afflicts flying wing aircraft by ensuring that the aircraft would keep stable at all times. It achieved this by having a bell-shaped wing that was long and thin, or what is known as a high aspect ratio wing. This design principle meant that the weight of the aircraft would be spread over a greater surface area during a stall or engine cutoff, thus creating greater drag and allowing the aircraft to slow down and be controlled. By the way, several decades later, Reimar Horten's bell-shaped wing would be called nothing short of genius by Al Boers, a NASA chief scientist at the Neil A. Armstrong Flight Research Center in California. Boers says that the Horten wing not only cancelled out the yawing issues that an aircraft without a wing can suffer, but that it also dramatically reduced drag whilst at speed. The Horten Ho's cockpit height was decidedly low at 1.1 meters, although its overall height was 2.81 meters at its apex. Unsurprisingly, this made the space incredibly cramped that it only allowed for one crew member, and even that would be damn tight for that person with their head likely bumping on the top of the canopy. The Ho 229's range was highly impressive, 1,900 kilometers or 1,200 miles. Noteworthy too because it was far in excess of the 1,000 kilometer range demanded by the High Command. It also had a flying ceiling of 15,000 meters or 49,000 feet, which was useful in terms of stealth. The Germans didn't really know it at the time, but the British were using a rudimentary radar during the Battle of Britain, and this aircraft would have been highly decisive in those skirmishes across the English Channel. There was also that other speed requirement. The speed capabilities of the Horten Ho 229 were a little bit less impressive. The Flying Wings power plant consisted of 2 Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines with 8.83 kilonewtons of thrust each. That allowed for performance outputs of a maximum speed of 960 kilometers or 600 miles per hour or Mach 0.77 at sea level. whilst having an acceleration speed of up to 977 kilometers or 600 miles per hour at its cruising altitude of 12,000 meters or 39,000 feet. And whilst all that jargon does actually sound particularly impressive for World War II, it didn't actually meet that requirement that we mentioned earlier of 1,000 kilometers per hour. Even so, it was said to possess a never exceed speed of just 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles per hour, which the conspiracy part of me thinks that the designers put it in there to make the head of the Luftwaffe happy. But then again, perhaps they were impressed by the takeoff speed of 150 kilometers or 93 miles per hour and a climb rate of 22 meters a second or 4,300 feet per minute, which was incredible for the day. In terms of armaments, the Ho 229 was hardly packing, being only able to carry two 30mm machine gun cannons. Nevertheless, the Nazis believed that an entire squadron of them would have been sufficient in what have been their main role, which was to hunt down and shoot the fleets of Allied bombers that were attacking Germany's industrial plants, main infrastructure, and largest cities. By 1945, Germany was being crippled by Allied bombardments, and it was thought that the Horten Ho 229 could stop that. And once the industrial capacity of the country was saved, why stop there? Could the Ho 229 technology be scaled up in such a way to take the fight back to England, become the new air superiority fighter, or perhaps even take the fight to the United States itself? Alas, reality made all of these ambitious plans come crashing down. The prototype suffered many technical problems. The only jet-powered example had a successful flight in February of 1945, but crashed in another test a few weeks later due to engine failure, which killed its test pilot. And then there was also the timing. All of the frantic testing was being done in the last few months of World War II, with the Allied forces coming from both the east and west, taking out slowly all of Germany's industrial capacity. In fact, a half-completed prototype among 3 other unfinished models was captured by General George S. Patton's Third Army at the end of the war. As with so many examples of cutting-edge revolutionary aviation designs by the Nazis, the Horten Ho 229 was a case of too little, too late. But all was not lost. The Hortens had left the aviation world quite the legacy. The flying wing concept conceived by the Horten brothers no doubt inspired post-war designers in the US. One such aviation designer was Jack Northrop, who had been inspired by the Horten sports gliders of the 1930s, not to mention the Ho 229 captured by Patton and all of his men at the end of World War II. The American designer had been hard at work at the XB-35 flying wing bomber design in the 1940s, which was unsuccessful due to its massive vibration. It proved that the Hortens had been right to use jet engines instead for the Ho 229, and perhaps that bell-shaped flying wing would have solved many of the other stability issues of the XB-35. Of course, I've got a video on these flying wing designs right here on the channel. Of course, it goes without saying that Northrop, that name should ring a bell. It was indeed Northrop's company that would later develop the highly successful B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. There is no doubt that Northrop's stealth bomber designs was inspired by the Horten Ho 229, given how many resemblances are there. Interestingly, the flying wing concept wasn't even entirely that of the Horten brothers. That credit belongs to a German aerospace engineer, Hugo Junkers, that had already patented a flying wing design back in 1910. The Horten brothers simply took the flying wing concept to another, radically modern level. And I think looking at these original designs of 1924 makes me really want to make a video about it. Experts believe that the groundbreaking work of the Horten brothers was done much to pave the way for the superior efficiency of aircraft in the near future, with a possibility of improved drag efficiencies of at least 70%, which is a huge deal in the world of aviation. The Horten design also does much to even explain the flight of birds, who, after all, don't need entails in order to fly majestically, like the Pelican. But you might be wondering if anything was salvage of the bold Nazi project that came to a sudden halt in the middle of 1945. Today, the only surviving Ho 229 airframe, which was the third version of the aircraft, or the Ho 229 V3, is housed at the Paul E. Garber Restoration Facility at the Smithsonian Museum in Sutton, Maryland. It had been moved there in 2011 by the National Air and Space Museum so that it could be fully restored. This sole surviving Horten Ho 229 has been on display in the main hall since 2018, alongside other Luftwaffe aircraft from World War II. It is also the only surviving World War II era German jet prototype still in existence. That's one very unique exhibition. It seems that the Ho 229 represented a fork in the road in Nazi plans for world domination. While the program itself might have been too little too late, had it gone on to become hugely successful, it would have paved the way for insanely ambitious plans to create a huge juggernaut with eventual plans to bomb New York. And that, my friends, is actually part 2 of this tale that you can watch early right now on Patreon or channel memberships. Come find out the various and insane ideas that those Nazis had to take the fight to North America, and how the Ho 229 would have been the very foundation for that outrageous and audacious plan to take place. I've put a link in the video description and you can jump in to check it out today. Special thanks to all of those Patreons who have taken the time to support the channel so far, and your lovely names are up here on screen. Thanks again so much for watching. Near the end of World War II, a new type of aircraft graced the sky. It was undetectable by radar, was faster than even the quickest interceptors of the age, and would even be able to cross the Atlantic in a single bound. But this aircraft wasn't British or American, it was Nazi. This terrible aircraft concept was the brainchild of the Horten brothers, who dreamed up this cutting-edge design to take the fight back to the Allies, and even had a sinister endgame plan to bomb New York itself. This is the never-built first stealth bomber, the Horten H-18. The plan, codename America Bomber, was more than just a top-secret Nazi aircraft, but in fact the first stage in a plan to assault and conquer the United States of America. The initial strategy was to harass the population centers of the East Coast, diverting US resources to home defense, and distilling the appetite of war of the American public. The plan also included a list of 21 targets, mostly aircraft manufacturers in the Eastern Seaboard, in an effort to ground the American Air Force. But its origins can actually be traced back to before the USA was involved in the conflict, to even before World War II. According to the book Spandau, The Secret Diaries of Hitler by Albert Speer, the Fuhrer was obsessed with the idea of New York in flames. In 1937, Messerschmitt hoped to win a huge contract with the Nazi government by showcasing a new plane design that could reach America, the Me-264. In 1938, the Luftwaffe's commander Hermann Göring gave a speech highlighting the lack of bomber power in the new German Air Force. I completely lack the bombers capable of round-trip flights to New York with a 4.5-ton bomb load. I would be extremely happy to possess such a bomber, which would at last stuff the mouth of arrogance across the sea. But it would only be later in the war in 1942 that the project would pick up speed. In April of that year, a project plan called America Bomber, with a K, was written and issued to several high-ranking officers. At the time, they believed that the HE-277, the Junkers Ju-390, and the Messerschmitt M264 derivative would be fine for the mission if they were launched from the Azores Islands, which I'll get to in a minute. But in turn, each of these aircraft designs were proven to be unsuitable throughout the course of the war. The ME-264 couldn't be equipped with the required armaments for the assault, and the other aircraft lacked the range, although it was rumoured that the Ju-390 did actually do a test flight to America, but this has never been proven. In 1944, the RML issued a requirement for a new type of aircraft, a strategic bomber that had a range of 11,000 kilometers or 6,835 miles for my North American viewers, as well as a bomb load of 4,000 kilos or 8,818 pounds. This of course would be perfect for a bombing run from Berlin to, say, New York, without stopping and without refueling. The top 5 German aircraft companies got to work and submitted designs. Unfortunately, none of these designs met the strict requirements needed and would force the Nazis to secure the Azores Islands, stock them with a battalion, and then use them as a forward bombing base. A requirement that was looking increasingly more troubling with the state of the war changing under their feet. There was also a second round of revisions to come up with solutions, but apart from flying to America, ditching the bomber and returning via submarine, there was little improvement. But there was one team that was omitted from the selection of aircraft designers: the Horten brothers and their flying wings. They had been omitted only because the powers that be didn't think that they would be interested in bomber aircraft, focusing solely on smaller fighter planes. The German command couldn't have been more wrong. The Hortens knew that they could overcome these design failures and got to work over Christmas of 1944 concepting their new transatlantic bomber. They cooked up a rough draft with weight calculations for fuel, crew, armaments, landing gear, and bomb load. Some of these concepts had up to 8 jet engines, but they settled on 6 as a nice middle ground. It would be a flying wing design, based on the engineer's previous works. Flying wings had several advantages over previous types of planes, with the entire surface area dedicated to generating lift. The aircraft could be 20 to 30% more fuel efficient and have a greater range. Because of the flying wing's smaller cross-section, it could also have a smaller radar profile, making it the world-first stealth bomber. But it wasn't without flaws, such as handling issues and requiring new types of engineering. This is the final brothers design that they came up with. It would be called the Horten 18, and it would have a crew of 4. It would have a length of 19 meters, a wingspan of 40 meters, and a wing area of 150 meters squared, which is staggeringly gigantic for the time. This flying bomber would use 6 Jumo 004B turbojets, burying them in the fuselage with the air intakes on the wing's leading edge. With these engines, the plane could cruise at 750 km per hour and a never-exceed speed of 900 km per hour, which, as you know, is practically double the speed of Allied aircraft of the era, making interception almost impossible. While range was never formalized, it is believed that it could do trips across the Atlantic with ease, with its payload of 4,000 kilograms of bombs. Despite weight and speed being a critical issue, the brothers managed to not only get in a topside defensive turret, but also forward-facing guns of some description. I wouldn't suggest that the plane would be useful in a dogfight, but it could certainly defend its own as it outran the enemy of the time. The landing gear, a new tricycle design, was created in such a way that it could be jettisoned after takeoff, along with some rocket boosters to help it get up to speed. The plane would then have to land on a forward skid when it returned to Germany. The entire aircraft would be constructed from a wood frame and carbon-based glue, resulting in an even more diminished radar signature. Whilst the engineers probably never really made it with radar in mind, at the time the Allies had rudimentary radar, and this would have allowed the aircraft design to scrape through undetected. The brothers presented the final design by February 25th, 1945 in Berlin. At the presentation, the original 5 aircraft companies were questioned if the concept was feasible and if it could actually be built. The rebuttal from the snub firms was silence, but you could tell that they were plotting something. The flying wing was superior to any of their original designs. A few days later, the brothers were asked to attend a meeting with Reich Marshal Göring, who informed them that the aircraft was to go ahead and be built in partnership with the Junkers company. If these brothers could pull it off, it would not only secure a huge propaganda victory for the German side, but the idea to invest in such a futuristic aircraft would secure Göring's failing reputation, perhaps securing himself safe passage in the likely event of Germany's defeat. The brothers had the funding, the knowledge, and the new industrial capacity. So, why did this miracle bomber never take flight? You have to keep in mind that the two brothers back then were somewhat unproven, and the so-called brilliant minds of the Junkers company didn't exactly trust their newfangled flying wing concept. Thus, it was at the first meeting to begin production that the brothers found themselves not in command and working with a committee of engineers who went over the flaws of the design. They had even invited some Messerschmitt engineers to the table as well, despite having nothing to do with the concept, refusing to move forward with the approved design until the engineers had had a chance to make some significant changes. The first major change was a huge vertical fin addition to the rear of the plane and a rudder to control the plane in motion. While it would offer more control, it would greatly increase the man-hours production and increase the drag, reducing the range of the aircraft. The committee also wanted to move the engines outside of the wing and strap them underneath in nacelles for maintenance reasons, which, you guessed it, would increase drag and reduce the range below Atlantic distances. In the end, the new design, called the 18B, represented little of the original Horton vision, with a moved cockpit, 4 engines, no turret, and a landing gear that didn't jettison. But it was approved, and work was to begin in autumn of 1945 in deep mines, with a new long concrete runway to get it up to speed. A side note here, there was also records of a further derivative of the A version merged with the improvements of the B version called the C or the B-2 version. It's hard to say what it actually was with little remaining of the project, but apparently it had 6 engines with a turret in the middle of the wing and had a huge tail even bigger than the B version. It was derived from both concepts together, but didn't really have the advantage of either, and was greatly disliked by the Horton brothers. So with everything finally on the table ready to go, why did we never see it? Well, the war ended in Germany's defeat. Increased attacks on German factories and air bases, plus spying and espionage and ongoing developments in radar technology, made the concept increasingly untenable. Plus, near the end of the war, Hitler was pushing the last resources to more and more absurd miracle weapons, and unfortunately the HO-18 didn't make the list. There wasn't enough materials, the capacity, nor the will to keep development throughout the period, and in the end, the war simply was lost before we saw this beast take to the skies. Using computer modeling today, we can look back at the design and see how far ahead of the game the two brothers were. It's been proven that the Horten 18 was so fast and undetectable that it would have been very successful in its missions, and aviation purity aside, thank goodness it was never developed, as the loss of life would have been catastrophic. But the idea of these flying wing bombers would have been a game changer had they entered the war earlier. There would have also been some more developments in the concept and given another few years even more crazy Nazi designs. Believe it or not, the Horten brothers planned a civil design, and it would have allowed people to quickly scoot across the Third Reich at a moment's notice with the luxury of a flying boat of the era. There are even some notes that after the war, this civil version was considered by British aviation. Oh, what could have been had the Hortens had divided politics from aircraft design? And who's to say that further versions of the design would have not also included parasite fighters like the Ho-229 soaring like a bird across the sky, ready to redeploy its arsenal at a moment's notice? Hey, that's a pretty cool name I just came up with. We could call it the Arsenal Bird. But maybe that's a video for another time. And as a footnote, if you're wondering what happened to the two Horten brothers after joining me on this journey about the Ho-229 and this America bomber, they actually ended up splitting ways after the end of World War II. Raymar Horten would emigrate to Argentina after the war after he failed to secure citizenship to the United Kingdom or move to China. He would go on to design more flying wing gliders and would also come up with a supersonic delta wing aircraft well before his compatriots in America. It's almost a mystery why he was never repatriated to the USA as part of Project Paperclip. His brother Walter would remain in Germany after the war and become an officer in the post-war German Air Force. Flying wing concepts live on with American engineering, such as the B-2 stealth bomber that looks uncannily like the Ho-18. And knowing how it was developed, we can say that the Horten spirit lives on. In late 1944, among various last-ditch efforts to stop the Soviets and Americans attacking them on both fronts, the Germans created a new weapon unlike anything seen before. A coal-powered flying triangle designed to intercept Allied bombers at supersonic speeds by, well, ramming them. Yes, this is a totally legit late-stage Mad Hitler idea. Stick with me today to find out the story behind the German coal-powered aircraft and its designer, Alexander Lippisch. Near the end of the war, the Nazis were getting desperate. On the east, they had the colossal Soviet war machine advancing, and the Allies had just opened up a new front in France. The Germans didn't have access to vast African resources as before, and their sea routes were getting cut off one by one. Thus, any new plane designs would have to forego the materials, the technical designs, and even ace pilots. Simply put, they needed a cheap air solution that they could build en masse. Enter in our hero of the story, Alexander Lippisch. The roots behind the coal-powered project go back to the early years of the war, when Alexander Lippisch, while working on the Me-163 project, had an idea of his own. The Me-163 itself was designed as a rocket-powered interceptor and had the future plan to be a supersonic one. But Lippisch thought that there could have been more done with the concept. He realized that if the design could be extremely cheap, it could also be mass-produced and be used effectively against Allied bombers, as long as it ran on an abundant fuel source. Not oil or petroleum, but coal. But I'll get to that in a minute. This possible aircraft simultaneously would allow Germany some respite from Allied bombing raids and also save resources that could be used elsewhere in the war effort. The concept went through several design iterations, names and variants such as P-11, P-12, P-13A, but it's the finals that we'll be focusing on, the P-13B and the production model, the DM-1. And excuse my German, because these were Ausflipping Wahnsinnig. The P-13A was more of a delta wing design than a flying wing aircraft, because of the large fin on top of the fuselage, and the interesting thing about it is that this would also be both the cockpit and the vertical stabilizer with a rudder in the back. Hence the issue with the designation, because flying wing designs does not incorporate vertical control surfaces like this one did. In front of the aircraft was an intake for the ramjet engine situated just below the cockpit. So it's more like a ramjet with a passenger strapped on top. Ramjet engines back then needed a starting speed to work, so the P-13A would either be launched by the catapult, rocket boosters, or piggybacked by another plane to a certain altitude and speed, which you'll see in a minute is most likely the scenario. But now comes the crazy part that you have been waiting for. The fuel for the chlorine engine was coal. You see, in the late years of the war, pretty much everything was scarce, and Lipicic thought that this would be a perfect option to create an aircraft that wouldn't be kerosene dependent. The way this engine would work would be by positioning a mesh basket filled with coal in granules inside the intake, which would then release carbon monoxide when ignited during flight, mixing it with compressed air, and then use this mix as a propellant for this aircraft. Unfortunately, this idea, although good on paper, proved to be just that, an idea, and the engine was never actually tested in flight. But I am getting ahead of myself. You might have also noticed with this design that there is something important missing on this jet, at least for an interceptor. Where are the weapons? Well, wait till you hear about this part. There was of course an option, especially the latest model, to have one or two autocannons, most likely in the range of 20mm MG151s, although it's hard to say if such a small aircraft could even carry that large of a cannon. Another option were high-caliber machine guns, but the main idea behind this aircraft was to use it as a kamikaze plane, sans the pilot killing themselves like the Japanese. As you can see, the wings were very thick, and the reason behind this is the leading edges of the airframe were reinforced. The P-13A would actually ram the Allied bombers at high speed, targeting either the tail or wings, making them uncontrollable and forcing the crew to abandon them. The pilot would then perform another run if possible, and if the aircraft was too damaged, simply jump out and parachute to the ground. Because with this design, landing wasn't really an option. Although later on during development phase, a skid was also actually added to the bottom of the fuselage, I guess for very lucky pilots to further test their luck with landing this thing. Making extremely cheap aircraft to just have it fly a suicide mission doesn't sound like it would make any financial sense. Well, there's actually more to it. By the end of 1944, the P-13A was actually developed enough to enter the prototype and flight testing phase, and a glider, now designated the DM-1, was built and tested started near Vienna. The project was heavily set back because the workshop was bombed, and then the prototype and team were transferred to Munich, where the flight testing continued. But by this time, the records indicated that Lipicic had already lost interest in the project and knew that it would never come to life. Instead, he pulled a Schindler's List move and pressed to continue working on the project just so he could save his students and engineers from being drafted as soldiers in the losing war. And this is exactly what they were working on when American paratroopers stormed the factory near the end of the war. But capturing the engineers and the design, the American command saw potential. The Allied forces, most specifically the Americans, got their hands on both the DM-1 and Lipicic and his team. Instead of throwing away his daft idea, they completed the testing for the Allies, and Lipicic actually started working for Convair after the war. And this is where the plot thickens. Convair started developing a new aircraft called the XF-92 in 1945, and many people believe that it was Lipicic who influenced and worked on the design. But that's actually not true. The Americans did their own research in parallel to the Germans on a delta wing design, but gaining access to the Nazis' research definitely sped up their development. These design notes were very valuable to the US Air Force and helped future development throughout the years. And do let me know if you want a video on this interesting jet as well. And as for our hero of the story, he died as a US citizen in 1976 and left a very interesting legacy behind. Perhaps his focus on developing a coal-powered jet that could ram bombers was the insane desire to save the Nazi Empire. Or perhaps this engineer was deliberately working on crazy ideas to starve resources and actually help the Allies. After all, who actually thought that this coal-powered fighter jet could actually work? I'll let you decide down in the comments. And that's the end of our story about the crazy German coal-powered fighter jet that could have saved the Nazis. And let's just say that that idea was not that far-fetched. In 1943, Japan was facing off against Allied forces in the Pacific and needed a heroic war machine to fuel its vast supply lines, which were now scattered thin over thousands of islands and huge territory it had captured. A war machine that would be the largest seaplane ever proposed. The Imperial Japanese Navy instructed Kawanishi plant to build a 400-ton mega plane with the explicit directive that it be a size and scale the likes of the world had never seen. These gargantuan stats belonged to what would have become a gargantuan aircraft, the Kawanishi KX-3, or as I like to call it, the Godzilla plane. It may have never been built, but for some aviation enthusiasts, the fact that it was even considered in itself is a remarkable feat of imagination, if not a touch of wishful thinking or even arrogance. Why was this mega aircraft proposed, and how would have it changed the tide of war in the Pacific? Let's jump into it. Our story begins when Japan in puller fashion, augmented by a further 4 to 6 turbojet engines. And by the way, this turbojet technology would have been made available courtesy of Nazi Germany, specifically a little company called BMW. Yes, the same one that would later go on to make cars. The aircraft would have required a crew of 24 men, with its range on a full load being around 18,000 kilometers or 11,500 miles. It would have been able to do this journey at a top speed of around 345 knots with a stall speed of 120 knots. Armaments aboard the KX-3 would have also included 19 25mm machine guns and a 50mm machine gun and weapons bay. Although its arsenal was never actually finalized, it was obvious that this relatively slow and lumbering aircraft would have needed a good mix of automatic cannons and machine guns to defend itself had any American foes strayed over its path. This aircraft would have truly changed the face of logistics for the Japanese armed forces, and to pull it off, the selection committee chose none other than the Kawanishi Aircraft Company. The Kawanishi Aircraft Company was a leading Japanese aircraft manufacturer during World War II, founded in 1920 as the Kawanishi Engineering Works in Hyogo Prefecture. So to enter the world of aviation, the firm developed the Kawanishi K-1 mail-carrying aircraft, allowing the company to take flight both figuratively and literally in 1921. By the late 1920s, the company was even experimenting with long-range record-breaking flights using the K-12 Sakura. The range of aircraft that Kawanishi designed and built during the 1930s onwards was highly impressive and just as diverse. And a few of them are worth noting here as they help explain why Kawanishi was the perfect choice for the later KX-3 mega project. First, a similar 1933 float plane, the E-7K or ALF as it was dubbed by the Allied forces in World War II, of which no less than 533 were built. And then we have the H-6K, dubbed Mavis, which was a patrol flying boat released in 1936 with 215 of that model produced. And these aircraft helped put the company on the map in the eyes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And it was around that time that the military took an interest in the firm and where our story takes a more sinister turn. The company had just made the E-15K, a reconnaissance float plane called the Shuni or Violet Cloud, in 1941, the very same year of the Pearl Harbor attacks. With Japan now entered a war against one of the world's most fiercest opponents, Kawanishi Engineering Works were set to full power with the development of other aircraft like the famous Emily Patrol flying boat, and scores of other prototype planes were made but eventually not mass-produced during the war. But this was the evidence needed to show how just prolific and ambitious the company was in its quest to make aircraft for Japan's military. And that takes us back to the start of our tale, the year of 1943, when the world was at war and Japan was starting to get stretched thin across the vast Pacific. Japan had the know-how, the resources, and an escalating reason to build. So why did we never see this Godzilla plane take to the skies? Simply put, the war ended before the project got into the air. It's noteworthy that several of the NE-201 turboprop engines were already supplied and the airframe was actually under construction by the time the war ended in 1945. So it's fair to say that the KX-3 was a serious project that was well underway, and had the war kept going, we would have seen it in service. Even after Japan's defeat, Kawanishi continued to design and produce flying boats such as the PS-1 and US-2, although the company would eventually be known as the Shin-Meiwa. That very same conglomerate continues to operate to this day in the same prefecture as Kawanishi. This firm is an important player in the international aviation supply chain, including for companies like Boeing, which is a kind of funny turn of events. The imagination can only marvel and the mind boggle at what the Kawanishi KX-3 might have looked like had it actually been built. And I, for one, am a little bit sad that we never got to see it, even though it was built for controversial reasons. Speaking of trying to build something, you may have noticed that I have joined Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, as well as Discord, with Found and Explained social media channels. So if you want to see other stuff like behind the scenes, then give them a follow. But if you want to take it a step further and become a supporter of the channel, then consider joining our Patreon or becoming a channel member. You get special access on Discord, get to see videos early, and even suggest future topics that you'll see right here on the channel. Thanks for watching.